Street in East St. Louis.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome, Illinois, and welcome, Dr. Jeremiah Weinstock, to today's webinar, Gambling and Suicide, the Who, the Why, and What to Do. So real quickly, before we get started, I do want to welcome everybody on, and I want to thank the Illinois Department of Human Services for sponsoring these great webinars. And, you know, we've got this particular webinar, Dr. Weinstock has put together kind of like a series. I really like how he's thought this through. So we're going to have a continuity of gambling and suicide, the who, the why, and what to do. So it's kind of like a series. So I really want to urge you guys, of course, I'm looking forward to today's episode. And then we're going to look at June 23rd at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time for installment number 2, and then June 30th, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time for the third and final installment. So yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this. And Jeremiah, I'm so happy that we're able to work together. I've heard from years, and a lot of the folks on the call have been through our 30-hour core training, which me and Dr. Ledgerwood, Dr. Dave do, and David told me so many great things. So I'm so interested to hear on what you have to share on suicide. And by the way, guys, I've heard Jeremiah speak in 2019 at the Denver conference, and I said, I remembered, I said, yeah, we do need to get this guy on our docket. So without further ado, Dr. Jeremiah Weinstock is a licensed clinical psychologist, professor of psychology, and the chair of the Department of Psychology at St. Louis University. He is an expert in the assessment of treatment of substance-related and addictive disorders, with over 65 scientific publications and research funding from the National Institutes of Health and the International Center for Responsible Gaming. His primary scientific contributions include refining our conceptualization, assessment, and treatment of gambling disorder, the use of contingency management in the treatment of substance use disorders. He has also co-authored several scientific papers on cognitive behavioral therapy for the treatment of gambling disorder. And Dr. Weinstock maintains a small clinical practice focused on working with individuals diagnosed with gambling disorder. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Dr. Weinstock. I look forward to hearing what you have to say today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Robbie. This is really a pleasure. And just to reiterate, yes, so today is part 1 of a 3-part series on gambling and suicide. This really will allow us to do a deep exploration and conversation, really. And I hope it can be a little bit more of a conversation than just me delivering content. So there's some questions I'll ask you during our time together. And so please use the chat to jump in and throw in questions or to answer the questions I ask you. We also have 3 poll questions embedded throughout the talk. So we try to make it a little bit more interactive. If also there's this dialogue that you want to have with each other, like, hey, that was really cool, or I didn't know that, like, please just put that in the chat. I really like to see all that as we're going. I'm going to ask Robbie to really monitor that chat, and please interrupt me if there's questions, Robbie, because I'll just be keeping going. But I really will love some questions along the way, and I'll do my best to answer them to the best of my ability. So today we're really going to be talking about gambling and suicide, and just here's some recent headlines about just sports betting and gambling in general from different papers around the country. And to date, no studies have really fully examined whether one type of or form of gambling is more likely to be associated with suicide than another. There's really lots of, unfortunately, sad tales of suicide associated with all forms of gambling. And so we will be kind of just talking globally about gambling. I'm not going to get too necessarily specific about one type of gambling versus another, although there will be a couple instances where I do so along the way. So the webinar's goals, and so this describes actually all 3 of the webinars and what we're going to do. But today, what I'm really going to do is describe important demographic and clinical risk factors that are associated with suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and actually suicide in the context of gambling disorder. So we'll take what we globally know about suicide, and then we'll look at it with the lens in the context of gambling disorder and see how the 2 sort of overlap as like a Venn diagram. Webinar 2 will be really doing a lot of work around identifying risk assessment methods to help reduce the likelihood of a suicide attempt. So what do we do when we identify that someone might be experiencing suicidal ideation or actually has some real intent and plan. And so as clinicians, how do we handle these situations? And then the last one will be really spend some time discussing how to engage in safety planning with an individual report's current suicidal ideation and or intent. And there'll be several sort of case studies in each of these sort of components so that we can do some deeper dives. Also, if people have their own sort of experience and they want to reflect that in the chat, please do so as well along those lines, because I often draw, and many people have their own experience with this that is really rich and relates to the content that we're talking about. All right, so I want to just, because I don't know where everybody's coming from in a lot of different backgrounds, I just want to do the quick overview of the gambling disorder diagnostic criteria here. I also have a picture up there. This is dice from the 2nd century Rome. So gambling is a human activity that is old as time. There's also dice that were found in Pharaoh's tomb, and there's gambling from ancient China. There's an ancient Hindu text called the Mahabharata that has sort of epic tales in there, and in one of them there's a tale of a prince who has a kingdom, and he engages in gambling against this wicked guy, and he gets so out of control and has this loss of control around his gambling, and the dice are fixed, or the game is fixed, and he loses his kingdom. He bets himself, and he bets his wife, his queen, and he loses her. And so gambling has a lot. It's cross-cultural, it's all over the world, and it's been here for a long time. It was not until 1980 the gambling disorder was actually recognized within our psychiatric sort of classification scheme with the DSM-3. And then most recently DSM-5, it underwent some revision. But really, it's first off, it's that preoccupation, gambling with increased amounts of money to achieve that desired effect. So that is the example of tolerance. If you do decide to cut down or stop gambling, you get very restless and irritable, and you have a little bit of an itch to go gamble. You've made some unsuccessful attempts to control, cut back, or quit gambling. So that's that loss of control. I'm only going to bet $100 tonight. That's it. That's my bankroll. I just have $100, nothing more. And next thing you know, you risked and lost $500. That's that lost control. You're really preoccupied with gambling. Think about your next gambling episode, how you're going to get money to gamble. You gamble when you're distressed. So you have a fight with your spouse or partner. And one of the ways to sort of decompress and kind of let go of that stress is to go gamble. I think of that old commercial from the 80s. It was a soap commercial for Calgon. Calgon, just take me away. Just relax, right? If you look at a lot of the gambling advertisements for casinos, they talk about gambling as a way of relaxing and special treatment and sort of almost like a bubble bath. Individuals, this is unique compared to other addictions, where an individual will chase their losses. So they lose gambling. Traditionally, this was defined as they would lose gambling one day and they would go back another day to try to win their money back that they had previously lost. Now with betting, with sports betting being on your phone right here, you can actually chase your losses almost immediately with in-game bets, and you can kind of chase those losses as you're going along. You make one bet that quickly, your team is getting blown out and you thought you're going to win that bet. And so now you got to make another bet to try to make up for that loss. Individuals also lie and conceal about their gambling behavior and their losses and time spent. They jeopardize or lose significant relationships, jobs, and educational opportunities. And lastly, they may need a financial bailout due to gambling. The gambling disorder, you have to have four or more of these 9 criteria, all right, in order to meet the diagnostic threshold for gambling disorder. There's also significant overlap here with the other substance-related addictive disorders in terms of overlap, in terms of all that, because they originally took a lot of those criteria and sort of matched them onto gambling. All right. So about 1 to 2% of the US general population meets criteria for gambling disorder. And then there are about 5% who are identified as subclinical. These are individuals who may be meeting 2 or 3 diagnostic criteria, but they're not above that 4 or more threshold, but they're still experiencing some problems related to their gambling. And one of my pet peeves and one of the soapboxes that I can get up on and talk about on a different day is that the diagnostic threshold for gambling disorder is 4. And meanwhile, the diagnostic threshold for other addictions is 2 symptoms. And yet a lot of the criteria overlap. And so one group, you get a diagnosis if you endorse two criteria of tolerance and preoccupation. And meanwhile, with gambling disorder, that's considered subclinical. So anyway, but we do have about, I would say this 1 to 5%, about 5% of the population who are experiencing some negative consequences related to their gambling behavior. There are some special populations who are at higher risk for and have higher prevalence of gambling problems, such as those who are incarcerated or otherwise involved with the justice system. College students have a higher prevalence rate of gambling disorder, and individuals with substance use disorders also have higher rates of gambling disorder than the general population. All right. So then another important sort of piece of terminology and things to get down is just the brief overview of our terminology that I'll be using today. And so I want to walk through each of these terms. And suicide by any method continues to be the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. There's about 1 death every 11 minutes. So about 5 people will die by suicide during this talk. That's a very sad statistic, 5 individuals. So this is a serious issue in our country. Suicide rates were actually climbing, and they're about 30% higher than they were in the year 2000. And over the last 2 years, actually, there's been a slight decrease since about 2018, but it's still not that much of a decrease. Let me put it that way. So let's talk about these different terms. Also, there's some other additional terminology that I'm not going to talk about today, but there's something such as deliberate self-harm that I'm not really going to cover as they're not really relevant or primary to what we're talking about today. All right. So suicide, first, I mean, this is pretty straightforward, pretty obvious, but a fatal self-injurious act with some evidence that there's an intent to die. So the individual does not want to live any longer. They just believe they'd be better off dead. And so they have taken steps to take their own life, and they were successful in those steps. All right. Suicide attempt is a potentially self-injurious behavior associated with at least some, again, there's that gray area with some, at least some intent to die. People may sort of have some questions about, like, was it really a serious suicide attempt? Did they really mean to do it? And so at least I go for let's just take the most conservative approach and say, was there even an iota of sort of this idea that they'd be better off dead, and they took a step to make that happen? All right. You'll also notice in the bottom right corner, there's 2 names there with the year. That's the citation, the source of where this information comes from, if you want to go dig it up and look at it. I'm also more than happy to provide anybody with some of these articles. They're from the academic literature out there. So, but this is just really nice definitions. In the United States, the most common means of suicide, by the way, is 3 most common means are using a gun, hanging, and poisoning. Men are more likely to use a gun, while women are more likely to use poisoning, such as pills. And so there are some differences there in terms of method. And this is generally the prevalence across the United States, not thinking about gambling disorder yet. What's also really interesting as I was digging in, doing some research and reading about the literature, is actually the 30 days after somebody makes an initial gun purchase, there's an increased risk of suicide. That is actually sort of the most risky time for someone to take their life via handgun violence, is the 30 days immediately after they purchase a gun. There's a huge study out in California that looked at basically millions of people who purchased a handgun and what was the outcome in terms of did they die and what means were they, by which did they die, along those lines. Next up, active suicidal ideation. So thoughts about taking action to end one's life, including identifying a method. So how you might go about doing this, having a plan, maybe even beyond ideation. We'll get to what that happens, but you're at least thinking cognitively about this and having an intent to act. So maybe you think about when you might do this, when would be a good time, where to do this, about how you might be discovered to maybe lessen the impact or make it even more dramatic, depending on what's going on. All right. Passive suicidal ideation, or thoughts about death or wanting to be dead without any plan or intent. That's really about escape. All right. And so that's one way to kind of think about it in terms of the difference between active and passive suicidal ideation. So I have my first question. It's not a poll question, but I just want you to use the chat. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being extremely concerned, how concerned are you about this little client vignette that I'm going to read you? Concerned about this client's risk for suicide. So 10 being extremely concerned about the risk for suicide in this client, 1 being not so much concerned at all. So here we go. I have a former client that I used to work with. This was back when I lived in Connecticut. And this there's a casino there called Foxwoods. It's about a 45-minute drive away from Hartford. And you have to go through this really rural stretch of Connecticut and drive on this divided highway. And there's trees lining you up on both ways. And my client used to say the best part of her gambling experience was the drive from Hartford to Foxwood. It was that anticipation that she was going to win and she was going to hit big and it was going to be a great night. And then she would also talk about the drive home on that same highway was the worst part because she had only intended to spend, $100. The next thing she knows, she spent $800. And now she's like, I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills. How am I going to hide this from my partner? How am I going to rob, what way am I going to rob Peter to pay Paul? All of these things. And so she would say to me, so sometimes I have these visions of just letting go of the steering wheel while I'm on Route 2 on that divided highway with the trees on either side. And the car would maybe go off the road and end up in a ditch. I wouldn't have to deal with the debt and hiding it from my partner. I know I won't do it, but the thought is really comforting. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most extremely concerned about this client's risk for suicide, how concerned are you about this client? 1 to 10. We got a 10, we got a 7, an 8, 7, 6. All right. 5s, we got some 5s. All right. It seems like we're in the 5 to 7 sort of range, right? She is voicing suicidal sort of intent. I would personally classify this because she's put on that set the qualifier at the end saying, I know I won't do it, but the thought is comforting. So that to me sort of puts it in that passive suicidal ideation sort of area. I am concerned, right? And there is a, yes, as Marie sort of notes, there is a plan and a method, right? And so there is that, there's a little bit more sort of intent, but she also has that qualifier statement. And just knowing this client, having a lot of interaction, I'm in that 5 to 7 range. I don't think she would quite necessarily do this, but we still have to have a lot of conversation about the topic. Now, let me give you another scenario. All right. So here's a client, and one day they just kind of blurted this out in the middle of the session. And so the client just said, I'm thinking about going on the dark web and using the last of my money to buy enough fentanyl to overdose. I lost my life savings, about $35,000 a couple weeks ago, gambling really recklessly. Yet I still feel like I can't stop this behavior and won't ever be able to escape this reckless actions like this. Blurted this out in the middle of a session, right? What, on a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you about this client's risk for suicide? Right, I'm seeing some 8s, but mostly it's 10, right? There's really a lot going on here, right? There's that, I've lost my life savings, this reckless gambling, there's the intent, right? I am thinking about going on the dark web and using the last of my money to buy enough fentanyl to overdose, right? So there is a method to have a real plan. They haven't yet expressed that intent to act. So maybe that's why someone might be down at around an 8, but this is a pretty serious sort of situation, right? Along those lines. This is so you would you would want to take some actions here as a therapist when a client might express that. So to me, that's sort of some of the differentiation that we have to do between what is passive suicidal ideation versus active suicidal ideation. You have to kind of think through these sorts of scenarios. All right. All right, so we have time now for our poll question. I'm going to ask Robbie to put it up and we'll go from here.
Here it comes.
All right.
Okay, true or false? The difference between active and passive as suicidal ideation is having a plan or intent. Mark A if that's true, or B if it's false. Dr. Weinstock just covered it. The difference between active and passive suicide ideation is having a plan or intent. Mark A if it's true, B if it's false. Everyone's answering pretty quickly here. And please remember, everyone, we want to test your knowledge, but we also want to know that you're here. So please do your best to answer all of our poll questions today. We're at 86%. I'm going to do a T minus 10. Okay. All right. Here's the results.
You did pretty good. Thank you very much. All right. That was our first poll question. So, and it is true that the difference really is between passive and active, active and passive suicidation is that plan and that intent, that there's really a means by which this might happen. Versus passive is the thoughts or maybe a little bit of that escapism along those lines. All right, so I'm going to close that poll one. All right, and someone put their response also in the chat. All right, so moving forward. Now we have preparatory acts towards imminent suicidal behaviors. Behaviors that are really consistent with following through with a plan to fatally self-injure oneself. So purchasing a gun, tying a noose, buying the rope, going on the dark web, right? Purchasing the fentanyl. These are all preparatory acts, right? And so that's another just sort of behavioral term we really have to kind of get into our head here. And then lastly is non-suicidal self-injury. So this is some people may call this self-harm. So self-injurious behavior with no intent to die. So cutting or burning oneself. Sometimes people will really do some things just to, it commonly occurs in somebody who's diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. The non-suicidal self-injury really differs from a suicide attempt in terms of the motivation. Really, motivations are really around the non-suicidal self-injury. They call it NSSI. The motivations are really to relieve distress. Some people say to feel something, so they burn themselves just so they can feel that pain. At least it's better than just feeling that emotionally numbness, right? To induce self-punishment, sometimes it's attention-seeking behavior, or sometimes it's just a means to sort of dissociate and escape a really difficult situation. Versus suicidal sort of intent and these other attempts is really, you want to end your life. You're better off dead. That's that stop the pain and the hurt and get out of this hopeless situation. So there's very different sort of things like that will be available. Someone has asked about these slides, and yes, I'm happy to share these with folks. And I'll pass it on to Robbie, and he can and then send it off to everybody else along those lines. All right, so we have our terminology. Here are the stats from the CDC, from the Centers of Disease Control. So nearly 46,000 Americans died by suicide in 2020. That's the year that they have the most recent data on. As I said before, one death every 11 minutes. So we've been on this webinar for 22 minutes. So 2 people have died by suicide. It's very sad, right? Suicide, and then here you have the thoughts about suicide moving down into the 3.2 million. So about a third of them actually make a plan for suicide, and and then you jump down again almost by about a third will attempt a suicide. And then the number who actually complete it is much, much less, right? Suicide is also the second leading cause of death among children and adolescents aged 10 to 14 and adults aged 25 to 34, so young adults. There are also demographic differences, such as men are more likely to die by suicide than women, although women are more likely to make an attempt, all right? And overall, our rates of suicide are 30% higher compared to what it was only 20 years ago in the year 2000. So that really says something about our society and sort of the mental health crisis that we're really facing in America, not even over the last 2 years, but really what's happened over the last 20 years. All right. So here I have a short video that I want to show you. This is from HBO Real Sports. They did a piece. I'll get to your question in a minute, Marie. They did a piece about sports wagering, and in there they talk about suicide. So I want to show you this because I just want to bring in a case example of a real story. And so Marie was asking about the suicide rates due to the pandemic. Actually, since the start of the pandemic, we only have data from 2020, and suicide rates have gone down compared to their peak at 2018. The decrease is not dramatic. It is a decrease, but it's not anywhere near back to the levels we were at 2000 along the ways. So the relationship between pandemic and suicide, the story is still unfolding is the best way I could kind of say it. Along those questions. So I want to put this video is about 3 minutes, and it tells a story of this is happened over in the UK, and it's about sports wagering. And so I just want to share this video because it's helpful to have real people, to have that narrative, to have that story as we're talking about this, so you can have real people in your head.
Big deflection off the back of Zuma.
In England, the country's major sports leagues began pushing gambling on their fans years ago. Betting parlors began appearing inside stadiums, and Premier League teams began partnering with casino companies, generating huge income streams for the lords of British sport.
Sport, particularly football, has become increasingly reliant on revenue from gambling companies in recent years.
What do you think of the fact that nearly half of the Premier League teams?
I want to pause this for a second. I want to back up for 1 iota. I want you to see the mother and just really focus on her face. In a little bit, they're going to show a picture of her again, a couple years earlier. And I just want you to notice how much she has aged.
Have sponsorships with gambling companies.
I think it's disgusting.
They're trying to make it look normal, aren't they, as part of the game? And we know a lot of people now who watch football don't enjoy it unless they gamble.
Judith Bruni and Fran Green know firsthand. They watched as a loved one was destroyed by an addiction to sports gambling. Chris Bruni was Judith's son.
See her over here?
And Fran's boyfriend, and a promising young electrical engineer. Like Chad, he started gambling on sports and couldn't stop. And like Chad, he was given a VIP manager who facilitated his gambling habit.
Chris once came up to me, I can remember, it was from this VIP person, and he went, look at this. He says, they tried to be my best friend.
He'd get bombarded with free bets, free spins, free this, free that.
Judith and Fran say that soon after a VIP manager gifted Chris an Apple Watch, he went on a 5-day gambling binge. Chris lost tens of thousands of pounds, and then asked his VIP manager to allow him to make even bigger bets.
He did contact the VIP manager, which then they almost encouraged him to carry on.
Chris actually texted his account manager at the gambling company and said, the maximum bet on sports seems to be just under 4,000 pounds.
Yeah.
Can you extend this on my account? And the reply was, well, it won't be automatic, but have a go. They want you to bet.
Without stepping in and asking, you know, does he need some help?
The next day, Chris lost 18,000 pounds on soccer bets. The day after, he lost 3 more big money bets.
What happened the next day?
My husband came in to me and said, you need to get up. Chris is gone. He's left a note.
What did the note say?
He just said that he loved us all, and that he needed to just disappear.
Did he mention the gambling?
Yeah, he said he couldn't fight it anymore. It had consumed him.
At the age of 25, Chris Bruni took his own life. It was just the latest in a string of suicides of young British men who'd become addicted to sports gambling.
So that's the end of the video. I show this video because I think it really, someone just said it's just devastating, right? I mean, and it's the toll, not only the loss of that life, right? Somebody who's 25 has the world, the future ahead of them, the world there, but the impact on the people around them. You know, you can see how the mother, I'm making a big assumption here, but it seems like she's really aged a lot, you know, in probably a short amount of time, and just how awful this must be for everybody involved. And he said, I just needed to disappear. And so what we're talking about is real life and just terrible situations that people find themselves in. And unfortunately, I also think that sports betting is becoming much more prevalent here in America, and we're not far behind where what's happened in the UK is going to be here. And so I think that as you are working with people with gambling problems, you're going to potentially see people coming in who are sports wagers and maybe getting themselves into some really deep holes very, very quickly in ways that they, people haven't been able to do necessarily before. And yeah, right, everybody is affected. So yes.
Big deflection.
All right. So I want to now just walk in, start putting our lens together around sort of what's going on in terms of gambling disorder and suicide. So kind of matching up the two, what we know about the two literatures and how there's sort of this overlap. So the very bottom there, there's a national registry study of gambling disorder. This was done over in Sweden, and they have, over there they have nationalized healthcare, and so they're able to have these big databases. And they went through and looked at everyone who died over a period of time and who had a diagnosis of gambling disorder. And they followed, they looked at people over like a 5-year period, and there were 67 people who died during this period of time. And that was only 3% of the overall sample. And of that, the leading cause of death among those 67 individuals was suicide, or 21 out of the 67, which is 31%. So we do know that gambling and suicide really overlap here. In terms of other components to talk about is, I'm going to talk about in different settings because people may be working in different settings. Was an inpatient treatment for gambling disorder. This data is a little bit old. It comes from Brecksville, VA in Ohio, where they have an inpatient gambling disorder treatment program. And 80% of individuals who came to their inpatient treatment program had lifetime suicidal ideation. So they had thought about it, and 40% had really reported an attempt in their lifetime. All right. So again, this is ongoing. This is present in this clinical area. In outpatient settings, about 40% report suicidal ideation. It may vary from one setting to other, but it's about 40%. 62 report lifetime ideation. So at some point in their life, they were thinking about it. All right. I wasn't really able to dig up some data on the lifetime attempts in that sample. Gambling helplines, it's anywhere from 11 to 25% of callers endorse recent suicidal ideation. So if you're staffing a helpline, 1 in 4 of your callers could say, yeah, I've had suicidal thoughts in the last 7 days. I've had thoughts that I might be just better off dead, right? 6% report an attempt in the past year. All right. So I also want to just highlight that, not all these stats are apple to apple when you go across the things in terms of time period and all those. And that just sort of reflects the literature by which we're kind of doing this, and everybody kind of assesses it somewhat differently in terms of all these sorts of things. All right. But what we know is this is common, this is present, and it's something that we need to be thinking about and be prepared to handle, because it's going to walk through your door at some point if you're working with somebody with a gambling disorder. All right. And you have to be comfortable. And we have to do this. We have to work with our clients in a very non-judgmental way and saying, I understand that you're saying this, but we also have to have some conversations and handling it in a professional manner that is caring and empathetic. All right. So now I'm going to walk you through the risk factors of suicide. And then we're going to overlay, how does that, does gambling disorder have that same risk factors? That's that same risk factor present in individuals who struggle with gambling. So here's this model. It's really big, I know, and there's a lot of things going on, and we're going to really break it down piece by piece. But what it really walks through is that, first off, if we go down to the very bottom, there's environmental factors. This lack of social cohesion has a big impact on all these things. And then we looked at individual risk factors right along here. In these 3 green boxes, there's distal or predisposing factors that are in somebody's history and their background, such as a family history of suicide or suicide attempts, family history of depression, right? Early life adversity. I'm not going to get into the genetics of things because that's not something that we as mental health professionals have any sort of ability to change. I think it's still important to understand that, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm not really going to get too much into genetics. And then there's sort of developmental or mediating processes, things that happen that increase the risk or the likelihood that suicide may be a relevant issue for this individual. Cognitive deficits especially around memory and problem solving. Problem solving is they don't necessarily see a way out of things, right? And that can also be related to high anxiety, high impulse and aggression, and chronic substance use. Again, chronic substance abuse actually feeds back into the cognitive deficits. We'll talk about that in a little bit, which then leads to, just before these events happen or these thoughts occur, what are the proximal or precipitating, predisposing sort of factors? So behavioral disinhibition, acute substance use, especially alcohol. All right, hopelessness and depressed mood, any other psychopathology that's on board, and life events, experiences that are happening in we go. So we're going to go through each of these sort of risk factors as we go through this, and all these kind of combine to create some suicidal ideation, and then some suicidal behavior, and eventually the act of taking one's life. All right. And so this is a big conceptual model, but it's really based on the research literature that says all of these facets are really important, and sort of some happen more early in life and some are happen more or more closer to the actual event. We're going to then walk through now talking about this Venn diagram of how gambling disorder and what's going on in the lives of it and the individuals with gambling disorder, how this overlaps a lot. And that's the main point that I want you to take home from this talk today, is that the risk factors for suicide are so common in the individuals that we work with who have gambling disorder. All right. But before we transition and go into each of these risk factors, we also really need to take a developmental perspective and look at how things happen over time. And so not all risk factors are the same for each person at each stage of life. And so this is another way of presenting the same information, and it comes from a different source. But what they say is basically here, the same basic individual risk factors, we put them into a developmental context. This approach is called a life course analysis, which is based on the premise that different risk factors come into play at different stages of life. What's important and salient around suicide in adolescence is not necessarily the same as it is for an older adult. For example, the impact of physical health problems does not really become a salient sort of risk factor for suicide until someone really reaches adulthood and older adults, right? So physical limitations there. If someone goes through and all of a sudden they're a paraplegic, they have a huge accident and they're no longer able to walk, and there's a persistent sort of health problem, or they have chronic pain, like chronic back pain, and they've done everything they can under the sun to fix this, and it's not going away, and they're just so debilitated, they're so hopeless about the future that they end up saying, I would be better off dead. And so this physical health problems really do not become salient until adulthood and later on. Meanwhile, a family history of suicide is a risk factor throughout all of developmental time periods. So this family history, it is salient. It starts to fade if the person makes it to older adulthood, right? But that really is something that's really important throughout most of someone's life. Personality disorders, especially ones that are associated with impulsivity. So if we go back to DSM-4 cluster B, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, are very salient during adolescence and young adulthood, right, in this area. So this is called the life course analysis. And so we have to think about somebody as they're moving through time and space along that way, things like that, okay? Mood disorders increase the risk of suicide over time, especially as people age into midlife and older adulthood. It's present in adolescence and is a risk factor for them, but it comes a little bit stronger as depression persists and remains for years and decades along those lines. So this is called the life course analysis, where you really have to think about somebody in a developmental context. Now we are here at poll question 2. So Robbie will hopefully pull it up here and we have some people will answer the question.
Absolutely. Here comes 2. And it asks, life course analysis of risk factors is based upon the premise that, is it A, need to look at the distal, mediating, and proximal, let me pull this up so I can read the rest of it, risk for suicide within an individual, or is it 2, or B, different risk factors for suicide are more salient at certain stages of life, or is it 3, some risk factors for suicide are not relevant because the specific path in life an individual travels does not include that risk factor. So which of the 3 do you feel life course analysis of risk factors is based upon? We're getting there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a few more seconds and then I'll share the results. 5, 4. Okay, 3, 2, 1. There we go.
I closed it, Robbie. I didn't see it. I accidentally closed it because I was also clearing the Q&A.
Oh, you're okay.
I didn't see it.
Oh, here's it.
All right, here we go.
Here
So
you go.
this was, I have to say, the hardest question I put in here. I do like to have one hard question in there. The answer is 2. Different risk factors for suicide are salient at different time points in someone's life. All right. That is so 57% of people got the answer here. Correct. 12 out of the 21. We got 13 out of 22 because someone put in the Q&A their answer, which was B. So this is the life course analysis question is really about, we need to think about someone in their developmental context of where they are in their life, and certain risk factors take on more importance, such as physical health problems take importance later in life. So it's just, again, thinking about a person as they move through time and space, and maybe potentially about also their identity. Sometimes those things are also really salient. All right. So moving on, and we are gotta get some move on here. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit faster. So let's now talk about these individual sort of different pieces. So we're gonna start taking this model, and I'm just gonna break off a little piece and we'll talk about it. So environmental factors. So media reporting on public figures who commit suicide increases the risk of suicidal ideation and actually calls to helplines. It's a risk, it's the contagion factor. So as suicide becomes more public, that idea enters into more people's consciousness. And so really, it's a big component of that. And so research indicates the duration, frequency, and prominence are some of the most influential factors that increase the risk of suicide contagion. So, so someone is more famous and they die, like when Robin Williams died by suicide, that really had a high risk for other ones. What's really interesting is that there are now guidelines for how media should report on suicides. And there's the website that you can go through. The guidelines include not reporting on means which the celebrity took their life, as reporting suicide method is associated with a 30% increase in suicide risk by the same means over the next 30 days. All right. So that's media reports. Access to means. So again, having having access to lethal means. For example, half of all suicides occur in the United States by firearm. And so if we somehow were to restrict access to firearms, the overall suicide rate would likely go down because that means is no longer available. Another way of looking at it is a firearm was used in 89% of suicides among those who were handgun owners. So among handgun owners who committed suicide, 89% of them used a handgun. And meanwhile, the means in people who did not own handguns, firearms or handguns were only the mechanism in 33% of those suicides. All right. So that is a component. All right. Lastly, around environmental factors is poor access to mental health care. We know that's an ongoing issue. We also know that individuals with gambling problems infrequently seek professional help. The biggest set of numbers, and this is somewhat dated, and I would admit that, is approximately about 10% of all individuals with a gambling disorder ever seek professional help, right? And so this rate of treatment seeking is very low. It's actually lower than some other addictions. Part of it is stigma, part of it's not knowing where to go and things like that. The rate of treatment seeking is very, very low. Although individuals with gambling disorder do seek treatment for other psychiatric problems, but gambling disorder frequently goes unidentified and unaddressed. There's also statistics out there showing that about 40% of people who commit suicide had contact with a healthcare professional. So not just mental health, but healthcare, like a primary care doctor, within 3 months of them committing suicide. And it says, okay, so there may be some access, but we may, it's very limited. And when people do get in, necessarily suicide is not necessarily being assessed or acknowledged, or even if it is, things happen. There's this life event where someone gets highly distressed and then they engage in impulsive action along those lines. All right. So check mark here for poor access to mental health care for gambling disorder, because many people with gambling disorder never seek professional help. All right. Next up is lack of social cohesion. We've had rapid changes in our social structure and our values in America. The primary example that jumps to my mind is the Black Lives Matter movement. 3-4 years ago, we weren't really talking about this as a nation, but now it's front and center. And I also want to add into that, there's been the response by the white nationalist movements, and they're now also getting a lot of attention. And so these rapid changes are sometimes associated with despair and worry about the future. I've had conversations with a friend of mine who's Black, and after the shooting in Buffalo, and she's just highly distressed. Like, when are we ever going to get through this? When is this ever going to stop? Right. And so there's some real despair and potential hopelessness. She was not at risk for suicide, but she was expressing something that many other individuals within that community feel on a daily basis. And for some, if it's tied in with other risk factors, may actually lead to suicide. Economic turmoil, that is something that we're also currently experiencing. Gas is $6 a gallon right now in Chicago. Last year, it was at this time, it's $3.50. I got that from AAA, by the way. Economic turmoil is very much related to suicide. Increases in unemployment and decreases in personal income are associated with risk of suicide, especially in men. We know that individuals with gambling disorder have some economic turmoil, whether that's losing their job, they may embezzle from their place of work. I had a client recently got fired from her job for embezzling. Their finances are really constricted and limited, things like that. So we have a check mark there. Next up, we have social isolation. COVID has been a big part of this, but people with gambling disorder have constricted social networks. We know this. So we know that this is a big component of that. Frequently, individuals with gambling disorder are either divorced, separated, or have never married if they're a young adult. They also engage in social isolation, that they hide their activities and what they're doing. So they don't talk to people and share what's happening with their gambling disorder. And so we definitely have that check mark there for gambling disorder as well. As you see, check marks are starting to happen pretty regularly between what we know is the risk for suicide versus what we know is going on with individuals with gambling disorder. Next up, so now we're going to talk about these distal or predisposing factors, the things that happened a long time ago. The big thing that I want to talk about here is the early life adversity. One common metric to kind of look at this is called ACEs, so early childhood experiences. And early life adversity is tied to suicide in that it's related to a host of other things that happen downstream: depression, cognitive deficits, response and inhibition. So that's sort of executive functioning, more likely to develop a substance use disorder. So these early life experiences, especially if there's adversity, can really put someone on a sort of developmental sort of trajectory towards certain outcomes. So we have ACEs, so these early childhood events. There's 10 of them. To run through them quickly, if someone's not familiar with them, these are 10 things, and I'll talk to you about what happens when people endorse these. There's physical abuse, sexual abuse as a child, verbal abuse as a child, physical neglect, emotional neglect. These are all just awful things that happen to it that we wouldn't want to happen to any child. A family member who is depressed or diagnosed with other mental illness. So there's mental illness in the home when the child's growing up. Leads to some chaotic and unstable upbringing, potentially, not always. A family member who's addicted to alcohol or another substance. So there's drug addiction or substance use disorder in the home. Again, it talks about instability, chaotic nature. A family member who's in prison. Again, talking about just adverse consequences and deficits in the family home. Witnessing a mother being abused and losing a parent or separation, divorce, or death. And so what we found in the research literature is really borne out is that ACEs are common in people, but individuals who endorse 4 or more ACEs, there's really there's this dose response relationship, and we generally cut it off around 4 now. 40 plus different outcomes are associated with the experience of ACEs. And really the exact risk varies depending on the outcome. But we do know that the more ACEs someone has, the more likely there's going to be negative consequences in that person's life. What we know about people with gambling disorder is that individuals with gambling disorder are more likely to experience 4 or more ACEs than individuals without gambling disorder. This comes from a study I did a little while ago, and it uses data from the North Carolina Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Study. So it's an epidemiological sample of over 7,000 North Carolinians. And we then just broke the sample into, they gave them a gambling screen, and we looked at their ACEs scores, and 37% of the individuals with gambling disorder endorsed 4 or more ACEs versus 17% in the general population, basically, of North Carolina. So thus, individuals with gambling disorder are more likely to experience a predisposing risk factor for suicide in early life adversity. So let's put that check mark over that box. All right, let's move now on to developmental or mediating factors. All right, so now we're getting closer to the event. So the presence of developmental or mediating risk factors can arise from both the presence of a distal risk factor that then comes into play in creating this. For example, early life adversity is associated with cognitive deficits around impaired memory and problem solving. All right, and these are key contributors to development of hopelessness. If you can't see a way out, if you can't problem solve a way out of your situation, then that generates hopelessness, right? So an individual with poor problem solving skills doesn't see a way out. Many individuals with gambling disorder have some cognitive deficits, whether due to a history of early life adversity, prior or ongoing substance use, and substance use is toxic to the brain and our ability to engage in executive functioning, ability to think things through, or maybe it's just also pre-morbid baseline functioning. There's just somewhat lower in some individuals, where individuals who are high in impulsivity and risk taking are that way too. So we can do that as well. And so we do know that, you know, there are some cognitive deficits. We also know over here on that high anxiety and high impulse aggression, with when we do some studies looking about, like, are there ways to break gamblers into groups or classification or buckets of different types of gamblers? You know, there's these different models out there. Some call it the pathways model. And basically there's they can break them up into 2 to 3 different groups. And one group is a group who endorses either high depression and or anxiety. So that's over here. That's very common as a subgroup or a type of people who have gambling disorder. And another group are the individuals who are high on impulsivity and substance use disorder. So that chronic substance use, diagnosed with some antisocial personality disorder, or in childhood conduct and oppositional defiance disorder. So we can see here that these risk factors that are all the developmental or mediating risk factors are present in gambling disorder. All right. We have all this going on here in gambling disorder. Not every single client is going to have all 4 check boxes, but many of our clients will have either high anxiety or chronic substance use or high impulsive nature. So we know that our clients are presenting with these risk factors. And then lastly, going over to this component, is we know that, you know, acute substance use, these are proximal or things that happen immediately before either the suicidal behavior or increases the suicidal ideation. All right, so these are temporally associated with suicide and they happen close in time. So acute substance use, especially alcohol, is associated with increased risk of suicide, especially intoxication. So acute substance use, the impulsivity increases, behavioral disinhibition. So that governor in your brain that says, hey, don't do this, this is a bad idea, that governor gets suppressed. The volume on that internal voice gets turned down or muted, in fact. All right. Psychopathology is another important risk factor, and we'll get into each of these in some moments. But let's first talk about alcohol. All right, so alcohol and gambling, they go hand in hand, right? So here's the jackpot 777 punch that Harrah's Casino in the Carolinas puts together. Here's an advertisement for Caesars Sportsbook. So there's your phone, and then there's a beer, right, hand in hand. We know that goes on, all right? We also know, this is a study that we did, this is 10 years ago now, where we looked at individuals who were presenting for treatment for gambling disorder. And we asked them about their drinking and tracked it over time. So this is just alcohol. And we classified people into different groups. We had some people who we classified as non-risky drinkers versus at-risk drinkers. And we used the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse had some guidelines for how to classify somebody as an at-risk drinker. And basically the guideline said if someone drinks more than 14 standard drinks per week or 4 or more drinks per day in males, that is a risky drinker. 14 drinks in a week, more than 14 drinks in a week, and more than 4 drinks in a single episode. You do either of those 2 things, you're getting classified as a risky drinker as a guy. For women, it's 7 or more drinks per week or 3 or more, or more than 3 drinks per day for females. You do either of those 2 behaviors, you're going to classify as a risky drinker. What I want us to focus on is this circle over here. This is the average standard drinks per week that individuals are doing. And we can see is that they're drinking a lot, and individuals were drinking in the sample 1 to 2 times per week. So if you're drinking 10 drinks in a week and you only drink once or twice a week, you're getting intoxicated, basically. We can say with good clarity, with good understanding and rigor that, you know what, you're getting intoxicated. Individuals who have gambling problems, who are thinking about making a change related to their gambling, or starting to recognize that it's a problem and it's damaging their life, are also about half of them, not quite half, are getting intoxicated on a regular basis as they recognize that something's going on with their gambling. In this sample, individuals chose to enter treatment. Some may choose a different path, a much more awful and tragic path. All right. So that's what I want us to highlight on here in this data. All right, time for a poll question. Our last one of the day. I'm going to back up, let Robbie do it.
Okay, cool. Let's see here. Let's get 3. Third and final for the day. Okay, launch. Okay, according to one study that assesses drinking prior to and during treatment, about what percent were classified as risky drinkers? Was it 1 or A, 20%? Or was it B, 45%? Or is it C, 75%? According to one study that assesses drinking prior to and during gambling treatment, about what percent were classified as risky drinkers? Was it 20%, A, B, 45%, or C, 75%? And we're right about 50%. Speaking of percentages, give you about 15 more seconds. Great job, guys. That's what I need. I need a little bit of Jeopardy music.
I think we're good.
All right, man. There we go.
So here you can see, and I also flip back to the slide, it is about 45 to 50%. And most of you got the answer correct there. So good job. Thank you very much. So I just want to highlight that our clients here are engaging in risky drinking, and that's a predisposing or a proximal risk factor to suicidal behavior and activities. All right. Last little bit that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk gambling and mood disorder. So gambling in response to depression is common. Gambling is an easy way to induce positive affect. Someone wrote in the chat they're using gambling as a means to release their pain, right? So also gambling is a way to relieve social isolation. Can't tell you how many clients I've had said gambling is a great way to be social without really being social. You can sit there next to someone in a slot machine and say, hey, how you doing? This machine's not really hitting. How's your machine going? They can have those sorts of conversations. Gambling also causes depression. So gambling losses temporarily induces negative affect and depression. Gambling losses induce feelings of guilt and shame. Social isolation frequently occurs due to hiding the problem from others. We also know that mood disorders are more likely to predate a gambling problem, that gambling then is a response to a gambling disorder. What I also want to really show you, this is a really cool study from the United States nationwide inpatient sample. It's a data set from the years 2006 to 2017. And they looked at what was going on with individuals who had a diagnosis of major depression, a major depressive disorder. And then they looked at, did they have also gambling disorder on top of that? So MDD without gambling is in blue, and MDD with gambling. And what you see in each instance, the presence of gambling disorder with mood disorder has a higher prevalence of either suicidal ideation and or suicide attempt. All right, so this is a recent study. And it really highlights that gambling, in addition to major depression, increases the risk above what we just see in individuals with a mood disorder as well. All right. So really, we see these risk factors going on and see that they're really going on and prevalent in what's going on. Psychopathology, also broadly defined, is associated with suicide. 90% of individuals who commit suicide have a diagnosable disorder at their time of death. All right. Life events, bad things happen, financial or legal difficulties, interpersonal stressors. They have to explain to their spouse or that they've gambled away all of their 401k, their retirement money. Interpersonal stressors, that sense of being a burden on others and not being accepted by others. These are all combined to create that hopelessness that then leads to suicidal ideation. So here's the big picture model, and I'm just going to put our check boxes. You can see pretty much they're everywhere. All right. And that's the take home message for today. And at this point, I just want to say thank you very much. Our next webinar will cover risk assessment that's related to suicide, especially as it applies to individuals with gambling disorder. So at this point, I just want to say thank you. And I know that we are out of time at this point, basically, but I'm welcome to stay on and take a couple questions if people do have some.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Weinstock. Great presentation. You're a great teacher. I like the positioning of how you started from the beginning, reviewing us with the gambling disorder and those symptoms and moving into this very important issue. You know, it made me think back. My first job out of grad school was as a crisis clinician, and this stuff is so important, especially as you said, if we're working with folks who suffer from disordered gambling or gambling disorder, we're going to run across that. And those of us who I know who are on this call do, you know, so thank you. Very important. Do you guys have any questions? You're getting a lot of thank yous and a lot of great compliments coming through.
Yes, thank you.
Any questions here? Very applicable to our work. I do have one question for you, Jeremiah, not to put you on the spot here. And I know when I teach too on how to position suicide rate with gambling disorder, I'm sure you've gotten that question too. And is it the highest amongst all the addiction disorders, including substance addiction disorders?
There was a small epidemiological study that was done in Ohio recently that found that the gambling disorder had the highest rate of suicide among any addictions. I would like to see that finding replicated a couple times before I'm willing to say that with certainty. But I think it's right there, and in some ways, because of the hidden nature of it, the shame and the guilt can really ratchet up so much more than we see in other addictions.
Yeah.
I mean, but each has their own set of shame and guilt that goes with that. So Elizabeth Thielen asked, how can we get coroners to start collecting data about gambling addiction amongst deaths by suicide? That's a great question. I unfortunately do not have an answer with that. I don't know much about how to work with coroners. Can I just tell a quick aside about this, about coroners? Sure. There was a study I saw recently. This was around opiate overdose, where the coroners would write letters back to the primary care physicians who wrote the prescriptions for opioids to tell them your patient just died on an opiate overdose. And it had a big effect on the prescribing physicians' then future opiate prescription behavior. So I think the coroners are open to research and how to improve healthcare systems. I don't know how to do it related to gambling disorder yet, but I just want to say, I think that's a really, and this letter was very basic and pretty stark, like, your client died on X date by an opiate overdose disorder. We see per the opiate registration, the statewide database on opiate prescriptions that you prescribed opiates to this person in the last 6 months.
Wow.
And it had an impact on the prescriber's behavior after that. And so I think you're right. It's about raising awareness, right? And you're talking about here, Elizabeth, with coroners. And I think if you would talk to them, I think they would be like, well, how do I find out? How do I know this? Because also lots of people with gambling disorder aren't in treatment. So how are they going to go find this information out? But I think it's a really an important sort of question. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Well, thank you for all this. And we welcome, we hope everybody's back next Thursday, same bat channel, same bat time.
Right?
Right. So next Thursday, we'll see you again. And again, thanks everybody for being on. And Jeremiah, thank you for a great presentation. I'm looking forward to next Thursday.
All right, my pleasure.
All right, guys. Everybody have a good weekend. Good rest of your week.